slides. All good? Yes. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to all who are joining us for this event on the OECD Roundtable on Better Housing Policies. My name is Alain Desserre, and I'm the acting director of the Policy and Research Branch in the Economics Department. I have the honor of moderating the first session of this workshop, which will provide an overview of the major challenges in housing and highlight some of the key findings from the work that the main directorates involved on these topics have conducted over the past few years and are still pursuing. Before I introduce the panel and give the floors to colleagues, I just briefly want to provide some context. So the event today coincides with the UN-sponsored World Habitat Day. The theme this year is to address the challenges and opportunities of rapid urbanization by focusing on the active involvement of young people in shaping sustainable cities and communities. Now, this is a thematic that resonates particularly strongly in countries facing fast-growing young populations and rapid urbanization rates, mainly in Africa and Asia. But the issue is of strong pressures on housing prices in metropolitan areas is also prevalent in many OECD countries, and of course, raising concerns of affordability and quality of life. We also take the opportunity of today's event to release our new policy brief on an agenda for housing policy reform, which provides a summary of the main highlights and policy messages from a multi-year project conducted at the OECD, and to which all the directorates represented on this panel contributed, and I'm sure which will be discussed quite at length in this session. I have some slides that when they're up, I'll turn. Just a couple of slides. Okay. So the involvement of many parts of the OECD in this work is a testimony to the complexity and diversity of the policy issues affecting the housing sector. In the context of the agenda for housing policy reform, the main objectives of housing policies are regrouped under three overarching dimensions, or if you wish, high-level objectives, which are efficiency, inclusiveness, and sustainability. Now, by efficiency, we essentially mean the capacity of the sector to supply enough housing to match the demand, both in qualitative and quantitative terms, but also in a cost-effective way. Inclusiveness relates to the possibility for low-income households and other vulnerable groups to live in decent quality dwellings that serve basic needs such as access to school and other amenities. Sustainability refers to the compatibility of residential construction and housing use with high local environmental quality and of course, climate objectives. Now, we know that on each of these topics or dimensions, we are facing major challenges. We know, for instance, that demand for housing has exceeded supply in metropolitan areas in many countries, raising issues of efficiency of the housing market, at the same time creating at times risk to financial stability. Adding to this the rise in home building costs, which have outstripped inflation, the outcome has been significant and widespread increases in real housing prices over quite a long period. At the same time, the more recent increase in mortgage rates have made access to home ownership more difficult for many households, contributing to broader issues of affordability. Just to give an idea, housing costs absorb more than a fifth of household income on average in OECD countries in 2021, and that was before the rise in energy and building costs, as well as the rise in mortgage rates that came in 2022, 2023. And finally, we also know that the housing sector is a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, energy used in homes account for 23% of CO2 emissions in the OECD, while the need for decarbonization is also closely related to urban planning and developments. Now, moving to policies, The broad set covered in the agenda can be regrouped in 4 broad areas. One is regulation, which covers land use and urban planning policies, but also energy performance certification and labeling. Second is direct public support, which includes the supply of social housing, as well as subsidies for low-emission residential equipment. Housing finance, which includes all forms of prudential regulations and the development of financial products that integrate the green performance of building. And finally, tax policy, which in many countries is designed in a way that creates many distortions that often exacerbate the excess demand for housing, while at the same time not being used optimally as a source of tax revenue. In each of these areas, you will find in the agenda a list of more detailed policy recommendations with references to the analysis that provides the justification and context for these good practices, but also the possible synergies and trade-offs between the different policy objectives that I'm sure will be discussed at length in this workshop. Finally, the underlying analysis you will find in the 2 brick-by-brick volumes that can also be downloaded from our website at the address that is indicated on top of this slide. So now, enough said on my part. Let me turn to my distinguished colleagues and panelists. We have Mark Pearson, Deputy Director of the Directorate for Employment, Labor and Social Affairs, Lamia Kamal Shawi, Director of the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities, Antonio Gomez, Deputy Director of the Directorate for Financial and Enterprise Affairs, Shardul Agrawala, Head of the Environment and Economy Integration Division in the Environment Directorate, and Åsa Johansson, Deputy Director now in the Economics Department, but until very recently, Deputy Director of the Statistics and Data Directorate, and she will be speaking mainly in that capacity. Let me start with you, Mark. One of the work topics in your directorate is to pursue policy strategies to promote access to affordable quality housing for all. What can you say about the major highlights and lessons from this work, and how does it relate to the agenda for housing policy reforms? The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Alain, and indeed, thank you for organizing this event today. I mean, I think this is one of those areas where we all know we probably don't give it as much attention as it deserves. As you can see from all the different parts, different areas of the OECD, different areas of government involved. I mean, this cuts across so many of our different objectives. And certainly, from my point of view, in the social area, absolutely fundamental to get this area right. So what I'm going to do very, very briefly is just summarize some of the work that's relevant on the more social side that we've been doing, in particular contributing, as you'll see in the policy brief, this wonderful list of priorities that we need to address in housing policy reform, the ones that round promoting access to affordable quality housing and strengthening the evidence base on housing policies. So I'm going to just give you a very quick view of what we're doing, and it's summarized really on the left-hand part of this slide here. Earlier this year, we released our latest version of something called the Affordable Housing Database, which brings together lots of data on the housing market, such as house prices, tenure, things like that, but also things like housing quality, affordability, homelessness, public policies to promote affordable housing, such as support for home buyers, housing allowances, and social rental housing. And just to give you a little taster, on the right-hand side there, I've got some of the data on the share of social rental dwellings as a percentage of the total dwelling stock in OECD countries. And you can see on average, it's about 8% of the OECD housing stock, but way more in some countries, over 20% or more in Netherlands, Austria, and Denmark. And that, of course, has a massive effect on how the different housing markets operate. Not going to go into great detail about all the country-specific support that we do. It's often working with my colleagues here on the platform. So, working with Czechia and Poland to look at how to expand affordable housing, especially for vulnerable groups, working very, very interesting projects on how to promote the financial independence of young people, obviously housing being a key part of that. That's a project with Greece, and work with Alain's team on how to increase investments in affordable housing in lots of different countries. But what I really want to spend a bit more time on, the rest of the time I've got, is on how the policies, the work that we're doing on homelessness. Super quickly, here's some figures on homelessness in OECD countries. There's about 2.2 million people counted as homeless in OECD and EU countries. 2.2 million. That's a lot of people. Obviously, it's you look at national statistics, everybody's looking at something different. Some people are counting rough sleepers. Some people are counting all those people who are in different sorts of help provided by the state. What we've got here is an attempt to bring it all together using something called the ethos way of classifying homelessness. And it's what we've got is people who are living rough are in yellow there. People who are staying in emergency accommodation are the ones in, well, I was going to say green. It's not really green. It's sort of grey, isn't it? Battleship grey or something. So you can see sometimes when you see, I don't know, Canada saying that it has 2%, 3% homelessness, and Denmark saying it's 7% homelessness, they're talking about something entirely different. And if you put it all together, as we do in this data, you get a different picture. But we also do a lot of work on, I should have mentioned that we do some country notes as well. They were, I think the link was on the previous slide somewhere. Yes, on the right-hand side. Well, those of you who get access to this PowerPoint, you can see that there's some country notes which go through homelessness data in different countries. And we're developing a monitoring framework to try and support countries collecting better data on homelessness. On the policy side, we've developed a toolkit to combat homelessness, should be finalized in the next week or so. When we've had a last consultation with countries, it's been prepared in consultation with NGOs and with countries and experts. And we've got 9 building blocks there, which are a key component to combat homelessness. And each building block in the toolkit, we discuss the relevance, a set of key operational issues that need to be addressed, and we make a series of recommendations on what policy should be doing. I think this is really exciting stuff. I think this work on homelessness, I think there's a great need to actually do more learning across countries. Maybe there's not enough at the moment. And we do think that the toolkit will be a really useful way of doing that in the future. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Mark, for this introduction to the work you're doing and some of the key issues and the rising concern about homelessness. We'll get back to this in a bit later. Now, Lamia, the work in your directorate evolves quite a bit around cities, urban planning, land use regulation, and the new geography of housing demand, which all have a lot to do with the efficiency objective. So what can you tell us about the recent trends and finding in these areas, and whether we can see shifts in housing markets following the pandemic?
Oops. Thank you so much, Alain, and good afternoon, everyone. So I have a PowerPoint presentation to show you a couple of interesting findings from our work. Basically, we cover mainly OECD countries, but we also work with UN Habitat, and we have a number of work that extend beyond OECD countries, covering developing economies. So let me start with the first slide. Yes, here we are. So we are serving in the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities, a committee called Regional Development Policy Committee, and a working party on urban areas. And of course, when you work on urban issues, you work on housing, and this has been the case since the end of the 19th. Often the delegate from the Working Party on Urban Areas are also responsible for housing. So basically here in this slide, you can see the wide range of things that we are doing, starting with data. It's very important to measure the phenomenon of the geography of housing through our regional and municipal databases, which include indicators for over 2,800 regions and 1,200 cities. We have been able to collect new data on housing, but also we're in the process of developing new specific data at the municipal level that will be launched very soon. And we have indicators such as covering issues like housing cost, rents and mortgages, housing size to measure overcrowding and house prices. And these data are regularly captured in our biannual flagship called Regions and Cities at Glance that is going to be released by the end of the year. We also have databases, subnational databases on finance. And here we have been able to collect a lot of data. It's not just OECD countries, it covers almost 100 countries around the world on housing expenditures. So this is for data. Then what we do, we support national and subnational government on urban housing policy through our series of metropolitan reviews and national urban policy reviews. So we are doing reviews in advanced economy, but recently, for instance, we produced a report on Morocco, which had a great focus on the question of housing. We are also doing that through our series of multi-level governance review. We produce, obviously, dedicated housing review, housing dynamics in Korea and housing affordabilities in Czech Republic. And now we are working with colleagues, for the implementation of the reform in both Czechia and Poland. A lot of thematic papers on confronting the cost of living and housing crisis in cities, on how to reconcile sustainability and inclusive issues, how to, to track the geography of housing demand, but also a forthcoming paper on financing housing policies in EU and OECD countries at subnational level. And we have two main flagship forthcoming. One is the OECD UN Habitat joint flagship, the Global State of National Urban Policy, that is going to be launched next month in Cairo at the World Urban Forum. And this week, there will be the global monitoring of policy for decarbonizing buildings. So we capture, of course, the issue of housing in our standards. We have the OECD principles on urban policy. And finally, we have a dedicated program working directly with mayors. I want to tell you that everywhere, when you ask all the mayors, what is the most important issue you have to address, they all agree that housing comes first. So all these works, of course, feed in the horizontal work of the OECD. So now I'm just going to show you a couple of results because it's very broad. First of all, on data, what we found that it's mainly a story of cities when we talk about the housing crisis. Our subnational data show that large and mid-sized metropolitan areas have seen the greatest affordability challenges. On average, across the OECD, buying a house in a city is 60% more expensive than in a town and 130% more expensive than in a rural area. And this gap has been increasing rapidly. Rising house prices over the last decade has been 36% in large metropolitan areas, while in smaller areas, house prices only increased by around 12% over the same period. Our granular data also revealed the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. For instance, while people still have strong ties to big cities, the rise of remote work has sparked a demand for more space, leading to increased interest in the commuter belt. And here you can see the example of Madrid. So all this type of data help policymakers understand where pressures are building and where new housing is most needed. Obviously, housing is not a one-size-fits-all approach. Here we are. So I was talking about the fact that we are going to launch soon our new municipal database project. This will include housing data for 120,000 municipal level and 550 state regional level governments. And the indicator that you will find, for instance, include a number and types of dwellings, ownership status, rents and cost, and energy use. And the map that you have here on the screen refer to the case of Paris. We found, for instance, that in 2023, much of the urban core will require more than 20 years of household disposal income to purchase 100 square meter of housing, and more than 50% of household disposal income to rent a space of just 50 square meters. So this type of data, we will have them for a large number of municipal and metropolitan area. So when we talk about housing, of course, it's not just a story of supply, it's also a challenge of quality and sustainability. And here comes the problem of the decarbonation. It's about decarbonizing existing building, but also new building. And it's becoming a major concern for many countries around the world, as building account for over 1/3 of energy-related greenhouse gas emission. I was talking about the fact that this week we are going to launch the global monitoring of policy for decarbonizing building, which will highlight how countries are responding to this new challenge. The graphics that you have on the left side shows, for instance, reduction in emission from heating buildings. And we can see countries like Canada, Finland, Sweden, they have been able to reduce heating emission over the past 2 decades, despite higher heating demands due to colder climate. So when you have bold policy, you can have concrete outcomes. And on the right side, it was quite interesting because we found that, we have different stories for different type of regions. Here we have the main energy source for heating different type of regions by countries. And we can see that the decarbonation needs of residential sectors vary widely between rural and urban areas. So policy, again, must be very much tailored to the specificity of different places. Decarbonizing construction is also essential. It's a new subject. And our upcoming report, which is based on a global survey conducted in 28 countries, show a shift from energy efficiency only to sustainable construction and circular building material. So I was talking about quality. There is another dimension of many other dimensions to measure the quality of housing, for which we are collecting data, for instance, on the question of overcrowding housing, something that we tend to think it's only a problem in a large city in the developing world. Yeah, it is, but also in OECD countries, we find that on average, almost 17% of low-income households live in overcrowded homes, with urban areas, again, typically having less living space. So to tackle these challenges, we need both to strengthen finance and multi-level governance. On finance, I was talking about our subnational data. On average, in the OECD country, subnational government account for 72% of public spendings related to housing and community amenities, of which a vast majority, 84%, is done at the municipal level. Our data show also how public spending on housing varies across different areas. And here, again, we have different pictures. Now, as I mentioned, we plan to upgrade this regional and municipal finance database, working with the European Commission to provide new figures. But I want also to mention the fact that we are also working on the type of instrument that cities can leverage to finance housing. And last year, we produced for the G20 a report where we look at all the different solutions to unlock finance for infrastructure and housing, proposing, for instance, to strengthen funding of some national government, but also helping them to improve access to external finance and enhancing some national financial capacity to manage investment projects. On governance at the national level, there are obviously issues with alignment of housing policy across different ministries, and our global survey show that on average, you have 3 ministries involved in OECD countries in housing issues. There is also the problem of misalignment between national and local effort, as many OECD countries lack a spatial planning framework. And this type of alignment have been explained in detail in this OECD UN Habitat Global National Urban Policy Survey. Last point, working with mayors, I was talking about that. We have a dedicated program working with 70 mayors from around the world. We think that these diverse housing challenges and financial pressures call for innovation. And we know that innovation is happening at the city level. Last year in their annual summit, the OECD champion mayors endorsed a political outcome, very ambitious political outcome document called the Brussels Blueprint for Affordable Housing for All. And you can see here, some of these commitment. We are tracking this effort. We're identifying the innovative practices that the mayors are implementing, and this is reflected in this report. And we are going to now help spread all these best practices. And together with the European Commission, we are going to release soon the Global Compendium on Inclusive Growth with a dedicated section on housing. And with Bloomberg Philanthropies, we are working with around 200 cities from all around the world to develop a toolkit for replicating these best practices from one cities to the others. So here are the, the forthcoming big report and data that we're going to release soon that I have already mentioned. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lamia, for this overview of fairly granular work and also for highlighting the importance of the spatial dimension, I guess, in housing. And in particular, this issue, I think, of multi-level governance and misalignment between sometimes responsibilities and incentives, I think is a key one that maybe we'll get back to later. You also mentioned finance. And of course, I'm now turning to you, Antonio. The work of your directorate specifically focuses on encouraging the development of housing finance in ways that are consistent with financial stability and economic resilience and also environmental sustainability. What can you tell us about the main challenges in this area and the main highlights of your work?
Thank you so much, Alain, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to this panel and for this such important event, which is really bringing together all the excellent work that the OECD is doing in housing. Of course, I'll be focusing on finance, on real estate finance, which is really key for housing affordability, but also to support the transition to net zero. And I really look forward to sharing with you some of the key contributions that we have been making in this field and some of our recent works. So I wanted to start by discussing two key publications and a chapter of another one that highlight trends in the real estate markets and policy recommendations to address them. The first publication, entitled "The Rise of Non-Bank Financial Intermediation in Real Estate Finance," explores the profound structural shifts in real estate finance recently from structured products to leveraged institutions and collective investment vehicles. It proposes key policy considerations to enhance resilience, including by addressing risks at leveraged real estate non-bank financial institutions, improving transparency in finance products and intermediaries, and adopting a comprehensive risk-based regulatory framework for NBFIs, non-bank financial institutions. The second publication, the Real Estate Finance and Climate Transition Report, warns that despite a decade of growth, green real estate finance markets remain small compared to conventional real estate finance markets. It identifies challenges in aligning green real estate finance market practices with sustainability goals. And in particular, this includes the lack of common definitions, standards, of quality data, and all of this hinders the ability of market participants and regulators to identify, to monitor, and manage the risks and the opportunities. Oops, I still have one more chapter to mention, which is the chapter 3 of the Brick by Brick Volume 2, the third OECD contribution I wanted to present. And this identifies the need to manage risks from non-bank mortgage finance. It also proposes a way to make housing finance stronger, more resilient, and a greater pillar in housing decarbonization. The chapter also recognizes that housing finance has a key contribution to make in reducing emissions from the residential sector. And this will, of course, require costly investment, with mortgage lenders needing to support housing decarbonization at various stages. So moving now to the next slide, let me highlight some recent work that really underscores the need of closely monitoring the developments in the real estate sector due to the potential risks it poses to broader financial stability. Nearly 20 years have passed since the global financial crisis, and no one is really eager to witness a repeat of those events. Our analysis draws insights from two important publications. One is the Global Debt Report that was published in 2024, particularly Chapter 2 that focuses on corporate debt markets, and also the Swedish Corporate Bond Market Report. And both provide a valuable empirical analysis of bond financing in the real estate sector, examining factors such as size, maturity, cost, and credit quality. The Global Debt Report identifies the low-quality corporate issuers within the real estate sector as a really significant potential risk in global bonds markets. And this is an alarming finding that really needs proactive measures to ensure stability. In parallel, the Swedish Corporate Bond Market Report reveals an increasing reliance in the real estate sector on the non-financial corporate bond market in Sweden. And this growing dependence raises concerns about the potential pressures that could arise from a downturn in real estate prices, further emphasizing the need for a vigilant monitoring. It is crucial that we address these emerging risks in the real estate sector. And as we move forward, we will continue to closely monitor these global trends in housing finance, especially amid the evolving macro financial context. Our commitment to this critical analysis will be reflected also in the next edition of the Global Debt Report that is going to be published in the spring of 25. And we believe that timely and thorough assessments will help us better understand the implications of these trends to financial stability. Additionally, as part of the OECD capital markets reviews, we will conduct country-specific analysis that delve into the role of each country's real estate sector within its corporate bond market. And these reviews will provide additional insights and policy recommendations aimed at improving the functioning of those markets. So thank you so much for the attention. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Antonio, for this review. And we know that at least the commercial real estate portion of the market has been hit hard in some countries, in some major cities, and that may have, of course, spillover effects for the housing markets as well. So it'll be interesting to come back on this maybe later. Now, Shardul, the work of your directorate is pretty much focused on enhancing the environment sustainability of housing. And here we have to think both mitigation and, unfortunately, adaptation. So please tell us about your work in this area and the main challenge and policy insights. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Alain, and it's a pleasure to be here. So just starting off with mitigation and adaptation, indeed, both recent trends in terms of increasing intensity of climate extremes. We just a week, just last week, there was a major hurricane, which again, posed this stark question in terms of, where should you be ensuring housing, and whether it's, what is the best strategy? Is it better off to move people away from high risk zones? Or is it better to just send market signals through rising premiums? And then there's the trade-off between disaster relief and ex-ante planning. But there's a whole set of issues around adaptation, which I'm not going to get into. What I will focus much more is on mitigation, and particularly as it relates to energy efficiency policies and investments in renewable energies. Now, here, the work of the Environment Directorate has not been on housing per se. We have worked on buildings because of their greenhouse gas and materials footprint, and we have worked on households whose choices have significant implications for the environment. So I'm going to housing is somewhere in the middle between buildings and households, and I'm going to be talking more about the households today. Let me come to this third round of the OECD survey on environmental policies and individual behavior change. This is a household survey, and we've run 3 editions of the survey in 2008, 2012, and most recently in 2023. And in this most recent survey, we covered 9 countries, 4 environmental domains, and we surveyed 17,000 households across these countries. And as regards, the main question, and this was our contribution to this last phase of the housing project, was how can public policy support households in making more sustainable choices as regards their immediate residential environment. And there's a more recent empirical analysis drawing on the survey, which is on household energy choices, which was published just this year. So let me just highlight some results from the survey. So some of the questions related to asking households, what are the key barriers to the installation of low emissions technology? And here I have split the results into 2 categories: those who live in apartments and those who live in detached houses. And then you have a series of responses. So in blue, you might not be able to read it. The answer is, it's not feasible for me to make this investment because my landlord would need to install this. The next one is, I'm interested, but I cannot afford it. I'm not interested. I'm not aware. I'm planning to install this, and that's the green. And the light green at the end is, it's already done. Now, on the left, you have apartments, and on the right, you have detached houses. So the most obvious result here is that for almost half of the surveyed households who live in apartments, many of these investments are simply not feasible, basically. This is the problem of split incentives, which has been known for some time. The next bottleneck is affordability. The affordability challenge is much more on detached houses. So feasibility is the main problem in apartments. Affordability is a much bigger issue in detached houses. And then you have lack of information, basically, which is sort of an equal share both in apartments and houses. And then you have the green, which is where the problem is already solved, so we're not going to talk about it. But this is the big difference between the living context, whether you live in a multi-apartment building as opposed to a detached household, in terms of your ability to undertake many of the investments that would be needed to reduce the environmental footprint. So now this is saying some of the same points in a slightly different way. So this is the percentage of respondents reporting that installing a given technology is not possible. And you see when they are owners, the percentages are much less, although the percentages do vary depending upon which technology you're talking about. So for energy efficient appliances, if you're an owner, it's not really a huge problem. Energy efficient windows also, it's a very small share where it's not feasible. But then when you get to more expensive investments, thermal installation, then solar PV, battery storage and heat pumps, it's a larger share even among owners. But if you look at renters, the percentages are obviously much higher. Now, again, this problem of homeowners versus renters is not new. It's been known for a long time. But the fact that you have a survey in 2023, which is pointing to this divide, shows that policies so far have not been able to meaningfully address this question of split incentives. And that's the real policy challenge here. How can we provide the right set of incentives where apartment dwellers and those who are not owners of their lodging can also undertake these investments which are urgently needed? And so I think, I mean, I've already said that, the tenure status and residence type have a strong impact. Now, what do we need to do? Now, there are a number of instruments which are being rolled out in many countries, which do address different aspects of the split incentives, either the owner versus renter divide, or there's a temporal dimension to the split incentives also, where you make an investment now, but the benefits would occur much further out into the future. So one of these innovations is green leases, where there are certain clauses in the housing lease that if the owner makes the investment to improve the environmental footprint of the lodging, then that could lead to reflecting some of the amortized amount in the rental value. So that sort of balances out the incentives. There's also the what is called on-bill financing, where some of the capital investments are essentially paid out as increments in utility bills. And there's a whole range of other measures which are being discussed and rolled out. Some other measures which are also providing incentives for homeowners to make investments in dwellings which are occupied by their tenants. For example, in Paris, where you have now increasing stringency in the labeling of the energy efficiency of the apartment, and a requirement that it has to be above a certain level of energy efficiency for you to be able to rent out the apartment. So those are also clear regulatory signals which are aligning better the incentives of the owners versus the renters. Then financial considerations are also important in determining installation decisions. So financial support for installing low emissions technologies, targeted subsidies. Again, these instruments have been there for a long time. They've just not been able to tackle when you have non-owners living in the building. And then attitudes such as environmental concern and a sense of personal responsibility also appear to be important determinants of investment. And this is where awareness campaigns come in. For us, I mean, if you look at households, there are several sets of challenges. With regard to conservation behaviors, it's mainly attitudinal aspects. And this is where information campaigns and other signals which directly affect decision-making are important. But when it regards to investments which reduce the environmental footprint of the housing, it's financial barriers and it's structural barriers. And some of these things that I've been talking about are much more structural, and we need more fine-tuned instruments to address these split incentives. So in these short remarks, that's what I'll focus on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shardul. This is indeed a very difficult challenge, and it will be interesting to see in a few years whether some of these new measures or policies that some governments are trying will have an impact, will finally find its way and affect the overcome the split incentive challenge. I heard today that the French government is slowing down on the idea of having labeling and on the limit date after which an apartment not satisfying a minimum requirement will not be able to be rented. I think they're pushing back the calendar. My understanding, they're pushing back the calendar on this, or at least that's a talk, and it shows the political difficulties with such measures. But nevertheless, at least it's an attempt indeed to try and solve this issue. Asa, you've been very patient. It's now your turn. We all know that the quality and robustness of analysis, but also the relevance and usefulness of policy advice depends heavily on the availability, reliability, and timeliness of data to provide the evidence base on which we can confidently make recommendations to government. So as your work in the statistic department, what can you tell us about what is the work there to support the collection and dissemination of high quality data?
Thank you very much, Alain, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting conference. And I'm happy to be here because housing is something that I worked on for many years, and it's an important topic. So you're right, Alain. It's very important to have trusted quality statistics, specifically in these days where there's a lot of misinformations and maybe fake news. So quality statistics is key. So one of the things that we've been working on in the statistics and data directors for the housing horizontal project is to focus on measuring house prices. And the starting point for this work has been that we need harmonized, we need disaggregated, and we also need easily accessible data for house prices, because that's a prerequisite for a lot of the evidence-based analysis that we heard from our colleagues here than talked about before. We need house prices to be able to monitor macroeconomic developments. We need house prices to measure housing wealth, affordability, and a lot of other things as well. So that's why it's important that we have house price indices that are comparable across countries. So in order to do this, we need to take into account that all housings are not the same. They are different quality, different age, and they're sitting on different lots of land. And some 10 years ago, the international community came together and realized after the financial crisis, we need better measurements of house prices. So they developed international guidelines. OECD was also part of that community developing these guidelines. And based on these guidelines, I would say all OECD countries are currently compiling house price indices for capturing how developments in the housing market occurs. So that you can see here on the bottom chart to the left, it says that we have today 37 countries with house price indices compiled according to these guidelines. The country that is missing is, I think, Argentina. These countries also compile data across different vintages. That means that if there's a new dwelling or an old dwelling, they also compile if it's multi-storage or single family homes. And that is helping to be able to come up with house price indexes so you compare like by like and adjust for quality, which is important in this aspect. And OECD comes in this role that we bring this data together, we compile the data and release it in a harmonized way. And most often this is quarterly data, but in some cases we also have more timely data at monthly level. And this database that we have created also contains another of complementary measures, for example, transactions of housing inflation, for example, as this is important to use as well in our analytical work. But one thing that I would like to mention that we did as part of the horizontal project on housing is to advance the regional dimension of this database. So and why is regional data important? We already heard from Lamia that this is crucial to assess what goes on at the local market, and housing is very much local. And they can help also to understand aspects such as regional geographical mobility, whether it's easier or not to move to a certain region. And currently today, we have 28 countries compiling some form of subnational house price indices. There is still work to be done in this area to kind of harmonize what type of regions that they are assessing. But there is still quite a lot of data available in this area. So just to go on, one thing that we also did as part of this horizontal housing project is that we all know that one important aspect of the data experience of user is that they can easily access and use this timely data. So during this project, we put together something that we call the OECD House Price Tracker, and it helps the user to monitor development in the housing markets. I just took a screenshot of the tracker because I didn't want to venture into trying to have an online tool showing you how it works, because usually when you do that, it doesn't work. But basically this tool is online and the user can go in and click and choose countries that they want to look at, and they can use a quarterly or a national annual data, and they can see what has happened in the development of house prices, but also on some of the other data that we have in this database. So instead of the online version, I just give you some snapshots of the data that we have in this database. So one thing that is important is house price indices, for sure. That's the basic stuff. So here, a user can go in here and they can say, oh, I would like to have a look at what happened on house prices pre and post COVID. So this is one way that you can display the results. So here looks at the house price growth in the years just up ahead before COVID and after. So that's one type of visualization that you can use this database for. A second interesting thing that we also all talk a lot about is what happens in the housing market, how fluid it is, what's the number of transactions. So that's something else that a user can go in and get timely data on housing transactions. And as you can see from this chart, there's quite a lot of action happening. And then during COVID, there's the number of transactions goes down. In some countries, transactions are recovering, while in others, they're continuing declining. And this, of course, is important because it can give you an idea of what is going on in the housing markets. And another interesting aspect that you can use this house price tracker for is that we can look at regional house price indices, how they diverge from the average national level. And I know that this chart has lots of lines and difficult to see, but one point that comes out here that I touched upon before, that currently the granularity across countries varies a little bit, and that you can see in the different number of lines in the charts. But what you can also see from this chart is that in some countries, there is a continued divergence from the national average, that we have some regions growing faster than others and others declining. But in some areas, there has been since COVID a kind of a revert back, which can indicate that there is some changes going on in the housing market, and that the regions are becoming, regions that we used to be not so attractive may have become more attractive and vice versa, because of things like Lamia mentioned, teleworking and these type of things. So that is kind of what I wanted to highlight, the work that we have done in the Statistics and Data Directorate on advancing the measurement of house price indices that is in line with the international measurement standards. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Hassa. This chart is quite striking indeed, showing that there is not a single housing markets, and even within countries, and the importance of the spatial dimension again that Lamia has emphasized is really important. Now, before opening the floor for question, I just want to go back to the panelists, each of them with one more question to dig a little bit deeper on their first intervention. So going back to you, Mark, first, a difficult challenge that you really highlighted, and it wasn't clear from your charts, but I suspect it's been growing in the last few years, this issue of homelessness. So one question is, what is the link with between affordable housing and homelessness? It may not be as obvious as it seems. And perhaps more importantly, how can housing policies support objectives to reduce or end homelessness?
Yeah, thanks, Alain. Yeah, I think, if you'd asked me this a few years ago, I probably would have answered, yeah, of course, sort of housing policy has some impact on homelessness, but let's face it, the real drivers are what's going on elsewhere. It's how many people are losing their jobs, inequality, whether the level of social supports in place for people who are jobless, even the operation of the health system, whether it's effective in providing support for people with mental health problems or with addiction problems. I think I would now nuance that a bit. I mean, obviously, all those things remain incredibly important, but I think it's becoming a little bit more obvious from the evidence that housing policy per se is more important. I mean, a classic example of this would be to look at the United States, coming back to what an awful lot of people have been talking about, the regional differences in house prices and housing markets within a country. I mean, if you look at the United States, obviously very different economic conditions across different parts of the states, but you can explain differences in homelessness really by looking at what's happening in the housing market much more than looking at the general economic conditions. Now, of course, the general economic conditions have influenced the housing market, so we get a slight circularity here, but still, it's the availability of private rental housing, the availability, the affordability of rental housing explains really most of the differences in homelessness that you see across the states. And you can think of other areas as well, where often it's, do you want to say this is a problem of housing policy or just policy coordination? People who leave institutional care, prisons, some sort of medical long-term care, or people who leave youth supports. If there isn't long-term housing solutions put in place, the probability of finding a homelessness issue is much, much higher. So I think, I think what's coming out when you look in more depth at housing policy and homelessness is the importance of getting that housing policy right. In our policy toolkit that we talk about for homelessness, we have this sort of 9 different areas. I think one of the roles, I think, of housing policy is almost in prevention. Actually, it's, if you have a decent housing market in place, it is so much easier to avoid homelessness coming through. So well-targeted housing benefits, universal prevention measures such as social housing being in place, they help make a big difference in avoiding homelessness. I think also those of you who are involved in this area will know that there's been a big move recently towards housing-led or housing-first solutions to homelessness. And I know that sounds kind of obvious. Surely that's what we should be doing, but it's not really what's happened in the past. The approach to somebody who's homeless has often been, well, they're homeless because they've got an addiction problem, so let's address the addiction problem, or let's address the employment problem. These days, more and more countries are reverting to a housing first solution, try and get them into a stable long-term housing situation, and then it becomes much easier to address some of the other problems that led them to being homeless in the first case. So I suppose, yeah, bottom line is, of course, all those things, as I mentioned, general economic conditions, of course, they're important, but maybe that housing, the role of housing, both as a cause and a policy solution to homelessness, are probably much more important than maybe we were thinking a few years ago.
Thank you, Mark. And I imagine in many countries, given what you said, addressing the chronic shortage of housing supply is probably also a major element. Now, from all the dimensions you referred to, Lamia, in your work, we understand this is not as easy as it sounds. And in fact, it seems to be difficult to reconcile objective of providing enough housing to meet growing demand, ensuring local availability of public services and other amenities, all the while avoiding urban sprawl because of environmental reasons and other factors. So what do you see are the main trade-offs between these policy objectives and also the main barriers to policy reforms in your areas?
Now, obviously, whether at national or subnational level, there are policy trade-offs. And the question is where and how to address this trade-off. At the national level, one key message that we have developed in our work is, this institutional fragmentation is, if housing is part of urban, it helps because you can better align different, it doesn't mean that you have all the solution, but it helps. So this question of fragmentation in the governance system is a key obstacle. At the subnational level, there is a better understanding of the different policy issues and the complementarities that can be generated through some innovative solution. Subnational governments, obviously, they are much able to pursue co-benefit at the local level, but obviously they are also facing big dilemmas. And in particular regarding land use, for instance, should they preserve, green spaces or use this land for new housing and infrastructure? That's a big question. We have seen that there are some innovative solutions actually where you pursue high density vertical type of building, but based on nature-based solutions. So sometimes they find some interesting ways to address this type of things. The question of balancing preserving traditional, architecture and the local patrimony versus the need for more modern, high density dwellings. That's another question. How to meet the growing housing demand without overburdening local services and infrastructure, because housing is not just about 4 walls and a roof. You need to have the basic infrastructure, the transport system, and you need to make sure that it's not so far from the economic activities, because you create another issue on transport. So again, there are a lot of concerned to align and to have a coherent spatial planning framework. There is also the question, should land be used for social housing to reduce inequalities, or you have to market housing to increase supply to attract talents and investors? And for instance, the work that we do as part of our regional attractiveness program, we have a regional attractiveness databases again, which we have been able to demonstrate that today in the modern world, the investors are no more prioritizing, fiscal incentives or land only. They want to have talents, they want to have good infrastructure, and they want to have good housing to attract those talents. So are you going to invest in providing housing for these skilled workers, or you use the land for social housing? The question, of course, about how to provide cost-effective social housing while maintaining quality environmental standard. It's very easy to do. It's not. It's very easy to say, not easy to do. And this is of course related to the short-term need, long-term investment, because in the long run, if you invest in low quality type of social housing, you will have to repair, so it's more costly. But on the other hand, you need to have the resources to do that. And finally, another type of trade-off, that we see typically in many cities is, do we need to restrict short-term rentals? Why we know that it can have an impact on tourism, for instance, and there is a big debate. So in terms of these barriers, we see that there are different type of solutions, but the key barriers are related, of course, to funding, and I mentioned that already, related to governance, two type of issue at the local level, the local governance system, whether it is organized based on a functional urban area, or it's very local. You can have competition between different municipalities. But there is also the question of capacities, because most of the great innovative solutions, they come from those cities that have high capacities. So in general, many of the other local government, civil servant, they don't have the capacity to respond to this issue. And last point, I want to rebound on what you have just been saying about now in the United States, this debate about, providing housing solution first to address not only homelessness, but opioids. That's the new thing. So I heard a very interesting debate among different mayors about that. And they say that it's very difficult to pursue this type of solution because the internal politics goes against this. They need to have the buy-in from the population, and most of the people, they don't want to do that. So you have to demonstrate that it has a positive impact because you are using the public money. And here comes the question of the local the local political leadership, whether you are able to to create a coalition of different type of constituency that will support this type of project. Otherwise, it's just impossible to implement it.
Okay, thank you. And it reminds me that in this sort of challenges, one thing we haven't explicitly mentioned, but it's behind this, is this not in my backyardism that is often prevalent and complicates the task of addressing many of these problems, including the supply of housing. Antonio, you did sort of alluded that we might be concerned about some development in real estate. Of course, we'll look at the next report coming out in 2025, but I mean, in particular, the commercial real estate sector has been in the spotlight recently. You've been monitoring the financial conditions of real estate of this sector. What do you see are I'd like to know if you can come back on what you see are the key risk to the financial system more broadly, stemming from this sector, both globally and maybe in China in particular, if you want to say a few words on that.
Thanks, Alan. So maybe the first thing is to say that indeed we've been monitoring this very closely. And one of the areas where we found most risk is in the commercial real estate area. And we've been seeing in various countries and various areas of the globe, commercial real estate prices coming down significantly. So they dropped 12% in Europe, they dropped 9% in the US. And of course, one of the reasons has to do with the post-pandemic trend of remote working, of electronic commerce, and etc. So far, what we've seen is that banks, because they are better capitalized, so they have more liquidity, but they have been able to face the issues with commercial real estate. But of course, we need to continue monitoring very closely those banks in countries banks in countries where banks are more exposed to commercial real estate loans. And I should say that, for example, European banks are more exposed to commercial real estate loans, but at the same time, the drop in prices seems to be relatively contained now. But anyway, something. There's exactly, compared to the US, that there's a lot more finance via bonds, for example, via the corporate bonds markets. In Europe, you have a lot more commercial real estate loans provided by the banks. But if we go to the extensive use in the real estate sector of corporate sector bond markets, what we see there is that there's been a huge increase in leverage, of course, because of the low interest rate environment, which now leads to a very, very high leverage real estate sector, probably the most leveraged sector in the economy. And of course, with higher interest rates, we now have a significant amount of debt that needs to be refinanced or needs to be repaid at much higher rates. So this is a concern. We have a sector that is particularly sensitive to interest rate increases. And this is why we need to monitor very carefully to see if we will not have downgrades in the future of real estate developers, for example, if we don't have defaults, which can affect both banks, even on their non-performing loans, or affect non-bank financial intermediaries that are very, very exposed to these risks. Just maybe very briefly to say that on residential real estate, we see housing prices decline in many countries due to the higher mortgage rates. This is more pronounced in advanced economies. But for now, we see that global household debt has remained manageable. But of course, we need to see. Just very quickly to say that a big concern is China. And China has a very big real estate sector problem. We've seen drops in prices, drops in sales, drops in investments. And the big concern is not so much about the direct spillovers into the international financial markets, but of course, an impact on the demand coming from China, which will lead to probably a slower growth and a general impact on the economy. So this is obviously an issue that should be monitored carefully, and we're doing that precisely in the reports that I've mentioned.
Thank you. Shardul, you already explained quite well the issue of the split incentive in the case of building. Is there other areas related to the environmental issues related to housing or construction, or that you see where you see some trade-offs or some challenges in implementing reforms that would help to achieve those environmental objectives?
I would say that they're both unexploited synergies as well as trade-offs. So let me just start with the synergies. I mean, if you make investments in improved energy efficiency and insulation, then your energy bills will go down. So that would actually contribute to housing affordability. I mean, once you solve the capital investment problem, then you actually have synergies between the two sets of objectives. But there are obviously plenty of trade-offs also. Lamia already mentioned several of them. So, I mean, this whole issue of, I mean, there are arguments to say that when you have densification of cities, then people will have to commute less, there'll be less environmental footprint. So then, do you relax building height restrictions, for example? Those are the kinds of things which run against how you see your city or preserving heritage and so on. So there are quite a few important challenges in the land use and spatial planning area. Another area, I think Lami also briefly mentioned this, is the sharing economy. Generally, environmentalists like the sharing economy because you are sharing an idle asset. So you're not spending a lot more materials and energy to build more, stock of hotels and so on. But of course, we've seen, the impact that it's taking. What's put on Airbnb, it's taking it away from the regular housing market and leading to unaffordability. So there are real social challenges in that direction. One trade-off which has not been mentioned, and this goes back to the point, Alain, you made at the introduction of adaptation and mitigation, is this adaptation mitigation trade-off. There's a lot of interest in city governments, including in Paris, in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving energy efficiency. But not many people are paying attention, including in Paris, that temperatures are rising and the number of days which might be above 40 degrees is going to go up each summer. And those of us who've been living here for a long time have seen that. I mean, there were heat waves way back in 2003 in Paris. I don't know, 10,000 or 15,000 people died. But many of those summers are going to become more common. There was a study done in Europe, and Paris is the least adapted because obviously the obvious answer is air conditioning, but that increases greenhouse gas emissions. And it's not a policy priority. Now, obviously, we can build new housing stock, which has better insulation and passive cooling and so on, but we're not going to replace the existing housing stock, but nobody's confronting this problem. What do we do? And what is the solution if you have 20 days of 40-degree plus temperatures and inside the dwellings, it might be 45 or 48 degrees? What do you do? It's not been addressed, at least in Paris.
Yeah, very good point. And you mentioned Paris, which is fairly in the north. So, of course, countries in the south are already exposed to some of these temperatures, already in some ways better adapted. Just very shortly, we're working on a paper that look at the implication of heat stress. It's mainly on productivity, but it addresses some of these issues. Will be coming out in a few weeks or months. But I think this notion of we have to be prepared for far more frequency of heat waves, let alone other, of course, environmental problems. Asa, what do you see now are the main gaps to be filled in the area of housing, and what are the challenges in filling those gaps? Maybe one thing we may be facing a trade-off. Of course, you emphasize the importance of keeping a quality check on the data we use and we produce at the OECD. The comparability, ensuring that there is comparison. At the same time, it's difficult to resist the temptation to take advantage of some AI tools, to do some web scraping, to get real-time data. How do you see the challenges in reconciling these things?
So thank you, Alain. So I would say that as in the statistical community, yes, as you saw from what I already showed you on the slide, that there are data gaps to be filled, and it's terms if you look in the house prices, there's some countries that don't have the house price in all types of dwellings and multi-story single family, and distinguish between commercial and other the household types of homes. So that is important to fill this type of data gap. But I would say that one thing that I also is important is, we haven't talked much about it. We talked about a lot of house price growth, but we also need to know house price levels. And that is much more difficult to measure. And currently what we have been working on in the statistical community and also the statistics department was, as part of this project, was to develop a methodology for compiling house price levels at the regional level. And why is this important? It is important because if you only look at the growth rate, it gives you a story, but you can see fast growing regions, but the level is quite low, right? So you have to have both to kind of get a better understanding of what it means for affordability, what it means for geographical mobility. So that is something that we have compiled, developed a guideline for doing this, and it has been tried out in Spain, and it's also been tried out now in the UK by the ONS. So one role that the OECD has in this is to kind of support the National Statistical Offices in compiling this type of data, because it's crucial. But when you think about this data, it is going as you rightly mentioned, official statistics is not always timely. They come with a lag. House price data can come with up to T plus 80 days, for example, which is quite long time lags. So how do you address this timeliness? And indeed, there's something that has been going on in the statistical community, not only in the area of house prices, is that all of these new developments on AI and has changed the statistical landscape. There's a lot more data available, and this data can be used to inform what goes on a more timely and more granular basis. So this is something that is seen as a complement to official statistics. It doesn't replace official statistics, but it complements and it can give you a more timely perspective and more granular what goes on. And that's important for policymakers that may not be able to wait for the official statistics. So I think the two communities need to work side by side. But one thing that one also needs to keep in mind is that all data is not good data. The data has to be a certain quality to give you the information that you need for your policy making. So leveraging new techniques with official statistics, that can be the way forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. Now, we have about 10 minutes for questions, comments, reactions from the audience, either in the room, I'm turning in the room first, and or I don't know if somebody is monitoring the online. Okay, do we have someone? Yeah, question there. Yes, Veronica. Oh, okay, Elsa. Yeah.
Hi, thank you first for the interesting presentations. I have a question regarding urban renewal. If you could maybe expand a bit more, if you have work on this topic, especially on a large scale. For example, I come from Israel, which we have a scarcity of land. So looking and the highest fertility rate at the OECD. So this is a very important issue for us. There are good example research on the topic of urban renewal across OECD countries. Thank you.
Obviously, urban renewal has always been a major topic that we have been addressing in our work program. And I remember, a long time ago, we were talking about, how to use a brownfield, to develop a new type of housing and district, new housing big project and new district. This conversation is taking place differently according to the type of countries we are looking at. There is an ongoing work that we are doing on Israel, especially to address the question that you have raised. We have just started, so we don't have the answer, but you are facing, of course, the scarcity of land. So the answer is going to be really different from what we can see in other countries. But in our recommendation to promote, to develop new social housing unit, it's really important to focus both on, the existing place, the existing available place that you have, and avoid to have additional to go, outside the city area. So we promote really compact urban development and high density type of areas. And in the developing world, we have been working a lot, for instance, with Morocco, but with middle income countries like Colombia and Mexico, where from one day to the other, some countries and even China, they have to develop new type of cities, the nouvelle ville. This is a big subject. This is one of the key answer. But here, it's not, again, a housing program. It's a city program. So you have to provide the infrastructure, the transport, and sometimes it's not done like that. So we have seen in some countries that they have been building new cities, without having any, even providing the basic infrastructure to serve this type of new cities. So the subject of urban renewal, we don't use anymore, the term urban renewal, but it's still very much, something that many countries are looking at.
Thank you so much for your presentations today. My name is Ji Soo Yoon. I'm a policy analyst at the Sustainable Buildings Unit at CFE. As I work on policies around sustainable buildings, now it is important for me also to look at sustainable real estate investment to reach the net zero goal, the scale that we need to mobilize the private finance. And but as you know, the sustainable buildings and sustainable real estate investment, there are two different animals, because sustainable real estate investment not only entails acquiring sustainable buildings, but also acquiring brown assets, but make further investment to make it into green assets. So my question is actually for Antonio, whether in your previous work, you have actually witnessed and seen key drivers or best practices, how the investment flow actually turns from brown assets to green assets. Thank you.
Okay, this is a tough question. Let me start by saying that some of our reports do address these issues. And we do have this report that I mentioned on real estate and climate transition. And again, there are a lot of schemes that are already in place to try to foster more investment into green, or to transform existing buildings, let's say, into having them more green. So, for example, there are countries that have put loan guarantees schemes in place, or interest rate offsetting schemes, or even giving a more favorable capital treatments to green real estate bonds, mortgages, and mortgage-backed securities. Again, this is ways that you could things that you could put in place to try to, in a way, make interest rates a bit more attractive to customers, and try to boost the financing volumes. Another thing that I think is quite important is that sometimes for investments, it's important to know what they're investing in. And transparency is not always the forte of markets. So you do need to invest a lot on transparency as well. And also transparency, for example, even on green building rating systems. You were talking about certification, but also on these rating systems, it's quite important that we have transparency, that we have comparability, that we have clarity about this. These are things that can help drive finance into more green real estate. But again, a lot more probably that we have in the reports, also to see how you turn a brown building into a green investment. But I'm sure that we can stay in touch, and I can give you some further insights, also connect you with the colleagues that have been working on this. Thank you.
One or two more questions. Okay, Boris, yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, a question that comes from the live chat, which is about gentrification. The question being, are there any silver bullets to prevent gentrification? And is there something special in that regard with respect to the lower income countries within the OECD?
Gentrification is something that is happening in many cities, of course. When you want, well, it's market forces. It happened, you know. You want to redevelop an area, market price increase, and of course, people are getting out of that. No, there have been a lot of interesting experiments in many cities where they have invested heavily in some district, but providing, you know, a number of housing unit that should be dedicated to social housing to preserve, you know, this type of mixity that we have, and that sometimes cities are not implementing, and they prefer to pay taxes, you know, to the government instead of implementing that. yes, obviously, when you invest, when you do an urban renewal project that you mentioned, you upgrade the district and you are pushing people out. So whether it's a small scale or large scale, that's the biggest subject. But there are some solutions to prevent that and to make sure that there are some units that are dedicated to social housing, for instance, to ensure some, how do you say, mixity, mixed use of, yeah, social mix.
I guess to some extent it goes back to the issue of having enough supply to, because as you move people, if there's enough supply, eventually that helps keeping the pressure on prices, and even as some areas get the renewal. And I've seen in some cities, these were areas that were really not really abandoned, but really suffered, and now getting a renewal, and it gentrification is part of that in some ways. It gives a new life to some neighborhoods, but of course, if it pushes out people who can no longer afford to live in these and are pushed out of the urban center, then that's
Is here another trade-off that you were interested is, you remember that many cities around the world, they started to develop like we call a green district, right? So they invested heavily, and the problem is that many people of prices increased. Many people had to leave their district because they were pushed out, and so yes, there are trade-off between the different policy objectives. When you do a green district, you may have people going out from the district, and this can lead to the gentrification.
Okay, I think this leads us to the end of our panel. I think it's been a very rich and fruitful exchange. I hope you have found it useful to better understand some of the interlinkages between the various challenges related to housing, and we know there are multiple. So this is clearly an area where the proverbial no one size fits all fully applies. That said, we hope that the breadth of the work and policy messages that you may have heard or may look into the work will help addressing the specific challenges in your respective countries. Now, the focus of the next session is precisely to hear from the experience of policymakers about the challenges in their own countries. And before I turn to my colleague, Luis de Mello, and the panelists in the second session, please join me in warmly thanking our speakers in these sessions. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Well, it will be hard to compete with the previous panel, but it was really great to see that we embarked on this journey about 5 years ago, and with the horizontal project on housing here at the OECD, and it was really great to see that colleagues on the previous panel really took us through all the different work strands that were core to this horizontal project. And even more pleasing to see that so many of those work strands have outlived the horizontal project and that there are so many new things that are being done around the house. By way of introduction to this panel, just a couple of words on what brings us here today. We heard from all colleagues on the previous panel about all the interesting lines of work that they are doing with their respective policy communities, all the evidence, the analysis that they are putting together, all the different messages that have emerged out of the last 5 years of work. The agenda for housing policy reform that Alain mentioned at the beginning is really the an opportunity that we had to distill all those messages, to put together in a very brief, basically a couple of pages, in what we hope will help policymakers around the world finding the right instruments to address the policy objectives that they are facing, to understand the key challenges that peers around the world are also facing, to navigate better the trade-offs that might exist between those different policy objectives, understand better when there are co-benefits that they can expect from given interventions, to understand better about unintended consequences of policies that they might be facing. So at the end of the day, we hope that by bringing together all those different areas of work, we'll be a bit wiser when defining, designing, and understanding better housing policies. But the moment now is really to talk about country experiences, to talk to people who are really designing and implementing policies in those areas, or managing agencies in their respective countries that are in charge of implementing policies in those important areas. We have 4 panelists on this panel. It's a great pleasure to introduce them here today. I have first on my left, Francis Rain, who is the chair of Ireland's National Competitiveness and the Productivity Council. I have next to Francis, I have Mitja Križaj, who is the Director General of Slovenia's Public Housing Management Company. We heard a lot about housing finance in the previous panel, so it will be nice to come back to this issue on this panel as well. And joining us online, we have José David Rodriguez, who is Vice Minister of Housing and Urban Management in Costa Rica. And we have also Oscar Vela, who is Director for Planning and Finance of Mexico's Infonavit. It's great to have you back, Oscar. You've been with us on several events from the beginning of the housing project, so great to see you back with us today. So we have about an hour and 20 minutes or so to cover different areas, different aspects of policy on this panel, and hopefully we'll be able to illustrate through the experiences and the experience of these different countries, 4 different countries here, some of the issues that we try to cover in the agenda for housing policy reform. If I can start with you, José David, great to have you with us today, an early start of the day for you, so thanks for making the time for us. We heard from the previous panel about the importance issue of dealing with housing shortages. We know that Costa Rica, like most OECD countries, to be honest, in this area, your country is facing shortages and is, hoping to find the right policies to address those shortages. They can be defined in terms of the availability of affordable housing, of course, but also in terms even of the physical characteristics of appropriate housing for the population. So what has been the experience of Costa Rica in advancing reforms and programs to fill this housing gap that you are facing, including by boosting home building? The floor is yours, José David.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to you all, and good morning to everybody around here in Costa Rica. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here and joining this roundtable. Well, I must say Costa Rica has a a national financial system for housing that has provided more than 400,000 homes since its creation. And that means back in the time in the 1980s, and that means that almost 30% of the stock of houses or homes have been created by this financial system for housing, for social housing. So, of course, that has been highlighted by our neighbors as a success, but we still face challenges, important challenges, and that need to be addressed. So the national financial system that operates through our BAMBI, which is the mortgage bank for social housing, provides specific responses to families according to each case, which is why that when it comes, for example, to large families, our social housing system it gives them a larger house that includes a third room, for example. So the same happens when it comes to families with other characteristics. For example, when we are talking about families that have a member with disabilities, or when we are talking about adults, elderly adults. So the public policy through different reforms during the last years have been addressing the needs of these specific populations. And that is a very important improvement that during the years have been developing within the system. On the other hand, the Ministry of Housing and Human Settlements, as the governing institution, the one that gives that directs the public policy on housing, on social housing, has been promoting changes to be able to choose the best places to develop the social housing projects that in the past faced a lot of challenges. So now we are taking very serious, for example, the risk assessment of these properties, these lots, the location, because we are deciding where the people is going to live, and that is going to have to take all the city.
I think we have a link problem, perhaps. Then,
yeah.
Are you with us, Jose David?
Yes, I can hear you. Do you hear me?
I lost you for a minute. Please go ahead.
Okay. So in addition to promoting these conditions in the new housing projects, our ministry is promoting also urban and sustainable types of housing. And we have been very vocal promoting a type of housing that we call BUIS, that stands for Inclusive and Sustainable Urban Housing. And the main idea, it's a very simple idea, that is to take advantage of the properties that are being unused in the urban areas and develop there small units, the kind of apartments, but within the social housing system, so that they can. It's a win-win relationship with the local governments, but also for the national government. And besides the opportunity to address the shortage of housing, we are seeing an opportunity to reconstruct our social fabric that it was based on our neighborhoods, as we call here, our barrios, that small town communities that are even within the big cities. And that's an opportunity that we are seeing as the same time that we are promoting construction in the housing industry. But now in parallel, I must say that in the political sphere, the housing sector, the housing area or topic, it's a very active topic within the Congress. And so that means that there is a very active, a very strong agenda that different congressmen and congresswomen propose within the Congress. So that requires that we coordinate and develop strategies to conduct and to recommend technical aspects to this type of proposals, and to get the better products of all of these proposals at the political sphere that we know, and of course it happens everywhere in all the countries. We know it's a topic that it's very especially very important in the political sphere. So we know that we need to be close to all of these proposals to make sure that these reforms are going to contribute in to facing the challenges and to address the challenges that we have here in the social housing sector.
Thank you very much, José David. I think you mentioned several important aspects related to social housing per se, but also the link between housing and how you can preserve neighborhoods in cities, how you can make sure that we address the issue of gentrification and other phenomena that were also raised before. Let me turn to you, Francis, because you know, you chairing the NCPC, you've been spearheading this idea that there is a link between housing and the competitiveness of our economies. This is a fascinating topic, and one that we don't really see talked about very often, as much as it should, when we discuss housing policies per se. But one of these far-reaching implications of the challenges that we are facing in the real estate sector also include how our economies may gain or lose competitiveness. What are your thoughts about this?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me this afternoon. And before I just tackle your question, I'm going to give you a 6-sentence, I hope, a summary of Irish housing history. So this is going to go for real productivity gain. Ireland had 100 years of population decline. Very low density of population, suddenly began to grow population-wise in the mid-1960s. Everything that took place at very low density, very, actually in today's world, non-sustainable. But that's the established pattern. That's what everybody expects. And when people think about dealing with housing issues, that's the direction they go. So that's really the background to my remarks, because we have a major issue at the moment with the most rapidly growing population in Europe, and certainly at the housing age, because a lot of it is immigration. And it means that proceeding along that long path, previous path, is just simply not a sustainable option. Furthermore, a lot of the younger people who've come to Ireland, or Irish people who've lived abroad, don't want to live in suburban sprawls in the way in which they did in the past. So looking at a solution to that is really important. That tends to put it in the space of housing, but not linked to the economy. So this brings me to the second part of your question. So where does this link in with competitiveness? Because we have a fairly rapidly growing workforce. I mean, we're probably getting faster than any other country in Europe at the moment. A lot of people with specialist skills are coming from outside Ireland. A lot of Irish people who've worked abroad are coming back, and they're looking for housing. So once you end up with a situation where housing is uncertain, where everybody can see and there's a persistent problem, then it immediately becomes an issue for a person. Well, will I consider coming to Ireland at all? If I come, I may get what looks like a well-paid job, but can I actually find housing? Can I have the kind of housing that I actually want to have? So what we've been doing is drawing attention to the issue that housing is as important to competitiveness as many other factors that people normally think about, like taxation, for example. We recently had a conference in one of the smaller cities in Ireland, and it was a mixture of people from different kinds of sectors. And the issue was, how would you summarize the morning? What were the big issues that the smaller SMEs, that the larger multinationals, that the local business people were concerned about? It was housing, and it was around having that range of housing that made sense. So for us, that really, we were aware of it, but it really came to the fore of how important this is as a competitiveness issue. So as I say, for the person looking at a job in Ireland or considering staying in Ireland or going abroad, housing is an issue that they look at as fundamentally as they look at availability of schools or what the job is likely to pay. Now, what that gives rise to, and this is what we were picking up from the industry, is that for enterprises, they're trying to hire people, and let's say you've got very specialist skills in ICT or in pharma, and you're going out on the international market. The person is immediately going to try to work out, well, where can I live if I take up this job, particularly if it's outside Dublin. And the whole idea is to not reduce the level of concentration and urban sprawl in Dublin. So you're trying to encourage them to go to other cities. So then they're going to look at what kind of housing they can possibly get. So what HR managers are finding is people are very uncertain about whether they'll accept a job until they've done an investigation of the housing market. And as we all know, housing is very local. Different markets in every country are different. So you have to do a lot of in-depth analysis to try to find out what you want. So that's challenging for the enterprises. And even within Ireland, we have many pharma companies, for example, and the ICT companies that have plants in different parts of the country. So even if you're trying to move staff, somebody who'd be really good as a manager in Cork who's currently in Limerick, for example, you then basically find it difficult to see if you can accommodate that change. And then for the economy taken as a whole. So for the individual, it's difficult, for the company, it's difficult, and for the country as a whole, it sort of risks, if you like, I mean, we have a very rapidly rising cost of housing. The numbers are it'd be quite scary when you hear them at every time. And I'd like to just digress there for a second to say how really important, I think Anna made in the last section, how really important this issue is about having good data on housing, because it really is something that statistical offices do, but they tend to do it with the lag. Very often, and certainly in Ireland it's the case, is you've got companies linking up with banks or with others who are trying to project their brand image. Fine, well and good, and they're collecting data to do that. But it's really important that it's done in a way that gives a correct impression. So just to say from the point of view of the economy, there is obviously a labour market resource reallocation issue that comes into play at a certain stage. There's also the fact that I guess delivering more housing has become a really big issue. And I think that's the speed at which we can deliver it has now become problematic. I think housing is very special. I'm absolutely delighted to see how much effort the OECD has been putting into this area. And I hope it'll continue to do it, because it's at the heart of the interaction between, if you like, the household, the business, the economy, the society, place. We all believe it's place. And one of my longstanding criticisms of economics is that we didn't take as much account of place as we should have done decades ago. And I know economic geography became fashionable again about 30 years ago, but actually so much is connected with place, and housing is the key unit. So from our point of view, I think what we've now convinced the politicians and the senior civil servants is that housing really matters, not just from all of the other societal pieces that they're aware of, but actually as a competitiveness issue, it's one they really need to take into account.
Absolutely. I think you mentioned one point, Francis, that is crucial. We are facing, many OECD countries are facing a very bad mix of labor and talent shortages in many parts of our economies. At the same time, inability to attract talent and labor because of the housing issue. And at the same time, labor markets that are becoming fragmented and very inflexible, because people cannot move in search of better jobs in areas where economies might be booming, because there will be no housing supply where they would like to be. So it's interesting because it's very different phenomena that are basically affecting many OECD economies, and housing cuts across all of them. Hence the importance of the topic, and also the difficulty of addressing that in the short term, which is the type of time horizon we would like to address those issues. Let me go back to the other side of the Atlantic with you, Oscar. You recall that in the previous panel, we talked a lot about environmental sustainability related to climate change mitigation adaptation, but beyond it. And we know that Infonavit has been a pioneer really in incorporating environmental objectives in your lending programs and your lending policy. What are the main lessons that you could draw from the experience of Infonavit in Mexico in this area? If you could share some thoughts with us, Oscar, thanks.
Of course, and I'm really happy to participate in this panel. And first of all, again, congratulations, Luis, for these efforts that the OECD has been doing for the past years. And as it has been mentioning before, putting housing as a policy itself, not as a residual policy, not as a policy that can be solved by economic growth or infrastructure and construction, It's been very useful, and we want to congratulate the work that you've been doing and the panel that you presented us before this one, in which you are showing all the improvements in terms of data generation, in terms of continuously participating with countries. It's really been useful for everyone. So congratulations on that. And going directly to the question that you are asking here, let me share with you a couple of elements that we've learned in the past in the few years before. So first of all, let's just remember that Infonavit, this is a housing institution, but it's for now it's currently financing mortgages. We're the main issuer of mortgages in Mexico. With 70% of the market of the mortgage market, it's has some participation with Infonavit. So it's financing of houses, the thing that we do here. And with this scope, with this we've been trying in the past years to different policies in terms of having engagement of households and the rest of the economy in how to improve the environmental characteristics of houses. So let me share just two elements that from our perspective has been illustrative of how these policies have worked. First of all, we have tried, let me call in quotations here, micro elements in which we provide access to affordable lending at the household level to try to induce via incentives or via subsidize in the interest rate of the mortgage, try to improve or induce households to purchase energy efficient appliances, or we're trying to induce them to install water treatment systems or elements that create a better environmental efficiency for the household at the household level. And this is at the individual level. So what we do is just make it cheaper for the household to purchase these appliances once they have engaged in a mortgage with us. So we have what have we learned in these policies, and this should now sound very standard and given all the knowledge and experience that the world has in everything related to how people react to incentives. So these policies are better or work a little bit better if they are mandatory. By this, I mean that if we sort of force people to give the lower interest rate in the mortgage only if they are forced or obliged to purchase these extra elements to the house in terms of environmental efficiency, then, well, when it is mandatory, then we see a lot of course, a lot of participation. The problem of this, of course, is even though it's mandatory, at the end, the household has the flexibility to go out in the market and purchase out of the market the appliances they want. So it's hard to monitor at the end by this indirect via whether or not the final purchase of the appliance that we're trying to induce to the household to purchase is actually working in terms of producing a better energy efficient at the behavior at the household level. And we know that when we stopped making this mandatory, when we just give the option to households to participate in these purchases of appliances, well, then immediately there was a huge drop-off of participation, and then roughly half of a percentage point of all the mortgages we issue in a particular year were households that were deciding to take an extra loan, even though it was at a lower rate, to actually make some kind of investment at their household. So lots of learning on this type of policies. I want to make emphasis on the aspects that you were discussing before of measuring and creating high quality data on any particular policy that you are trying, try to manage whether if it was effective or not. And in this particular case, we do have a lot of administrative data that can be shared and can be used for case studies in whether what types of individuals self-select into this kind of policies when they have the flexibility to ask for a mortgage that has some cheaper price if they are willing to purchase some investment toward a house in order to make it more environmental efficient. So that's a family of policies. And the other one that we have started doing after the pandemic event and since 2022, we kind of shift the conditions in which we give access to our lending, shifting the conditions in order to lend only if the houses or the units that we are giving the mortgage is parametrically near to healthcare services, near to schools, near to infrastructure related to communications. So we're basing these rules in the UN concept of adequate housing, in which it's been proved, and there's a growing body of literature that it's telling us that this will sound very obvious, that you can have a lot more impact in terms of reducing carbon emissions if you are located or you live in a place that is located close to good infrastructure of communications, close to your employment opportunities, close to other services that will allow you to make commuting less expensive, therefore less use of cars, etc. And then this is a more effective way through housing to actually create a better environmental atmosphere. So what we've done here, it's every mortgage we issue now since May 2022 and going on has to satisfy certain specific parametric characteristics. The house has to be not too far away. And again, this is not ambiguous. This is parametrically measured and with software that we are using. But we only are issuing mortgages to houses that are well located in terms of these adequate housing concepts of the United Nations. So this has been very interesting in general. And let's discuss again the possible flip side on this kind of policies. And we have to discuss about pricing. The better the location of the house, of course, at the end, it could affect affordability for the individuals. And Infonavit's main policy beneficiaries are households of middle to low income in general opportunities. So from one side, we're trying to promote better financing of a better asset, of an asset that is well located, that is going to have the household close to the items that make the house more valuable. But at the other side, we need to deal with how to maintain the affordability of an access to this housing for lower to middle income individuals. And we've tried to do so again through the interest rates, trying to maintain interest rates as low as we can and in a level that makes the institute solvent in the long run, and at the same time trying to promote policies. This is not a specific subsidy, but these are policies that try to increase at the maximum level of the loans that we can give to households, extending the period of repayment or trying to issue continuous renegotiations on the term of the mortgage in order for them to have access to a better or a more affordable price at the beginning, and then having some aspects of refinancing throughout the life of the mortgage. So in summary, two types of policies. One is at the household level, lots of flexibility for individuals. They opt in to purchase some sort of appliances or investment in infrastructure in their houses, and therefore produce in order to have a better energy consumption. It's very viewed as mandatory, but there's an indirect element that you cannot control, and it's hard to measure the effect on practice. And the other more effective is the second one, in which you more centralized control where do you want to finance the house, and then give all your efforts and the batteries of the policy to make it affordable and guarantee that the house is going to be adequately located, and therefore in this way you can create a better urban atmosphere and a more efficient environmental effect there. So combining these elements in general, I think it's could be a good idea, but again, there's a lot of conversation that needs to be done and research that needs to be done to keep understanding which is better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oscar. We'll come back to some of these issues. You're absolutely right that there is a lot more that can be done to unpack the different effects that that go into the type of program design that you described. Very interesting also how you are putting housing finance or you're turning housing finance rather into a vehicle for other policy interventions that would help to achieve objectives in the housing area, but also in the sustainability area at the same time. So interesting innovation there. If I can turn to you, Mitja, coming back to Europe. We've talked a lot in the previous panel, and also Oscar and Jose David mentioned the issue of affordability and how you can design programs for social and affordable housing. Tell us a bit more about the DSU's role in this in Slovenia, your main policy objectives in this area, and what you are trying to achieve in this space.
Thank you, Luis. I must say that listening to the other panelists and also other speakers before me, I must say that Slovenia is not so much different as any other countries, and we are facing very similar issues. In order, to get also the role of DSU in the right perspective, I think it's important to know a couple of facts about Slovenia in terms of the housing and the social housing. In Slovenia, we used to have a really big social housing portfolio in place in times of former Yugoslavia, which was privatized in beginning of 90s, which actually has caused a very high ownership ratio of the housing in Slovenia, which is on the level of 88%. Currently, there are unofficial information. This was also put as a finding in recent OECD review of Slovenia. There is a really high vacancy rate of housing in Slovenia, which is very specific. However, we see that we don't have really good analysis about what these empty units are and where these units are activated and how to basically activate this empty housing gap. Then, according to this, there are estimations that there are approximately 30,000 units gap currently in the market. Nevertheless, obviously, we have a big structural problem there about where this housing really is and how this housing is utilized. The same as with other countries in Europe, also in Slovenia, the housing prices grew really high in the post-COVID era. Also, this was also coupled with really high hikes of construction prices in Slovenia, which actually caused really a big problem for especially young people to get independent. Slovenia is one of among one of the highest ranked countries within OECD by number of young people still living at parents at the age of 36. So it's obviously that young people have very big problems to get independent from the nest, from the parents. So currently the current government has set housing policies quite high on their agenda, and policies are mainly directed into two areas. Basically, first, to activate empty housing stock, which is obviously there. The question is how to activate it. This is taught in various directions. Obviously, taxation is one of the possibilities. and and the other direction is to increase the supply of non-limited or non-profit rental housing stock in the market. So this will be done, this is planned to be done by two channels, basically by utilizing the existing social housing network, which is obviously lacking mostly funding. And in addition, government also decided to set a role for DSU. DSU is a state-owned real estate asset management company, which was so far focused on operation and rental activities, offering mainly office space to various governmental institutions. So government decided to transfer by recently adopted state asset management strategy. Government has decided to transfer all the remaining assets from the Slovenian bed bank, similarly as NAMA in Ireland, to DSU, and to utilize these assets to development of the social housing scheme. So basically our task is now to resell these assets, use these assets as an equity for development of what we plan now with this portfolio to develop 2,500 new units in the period of next 7 to 10 years. So this is basically the role that DSU has started to play.
It's interesting, Mitya, you mentioned a case that it's sometimes difficult to explain to people that you can have scarcity in the middle of abundance, and how difficult it is to sometimes even understand what a vacant property might be like, you know, and how much there is in our countries. I think that goes back to a point that you mentioned, Francis, and that also mentioned in the previous panel, that you know, measuring these things is often easier said than done, and how politically charged it is sometimes to navigate those problems when you're trying to design policies that could address this issue of you know, reconciling shortages with what may be on the surface considered an abundance of properties. But Francis, I think in Ireland, you know the issue very well.
Yeah, let me just come back in on that. I mean, I think one of the issues, so every country is faced with the sustainability issue, the green environment, the energy piece, and all of that. So we want the next set of housing to be much more compliant, much better in terms of the future. We have to do that. The other issue then is of getting existing housing back into use that's sitting there, because then there's no concrete used in creating that house. So there's a benefit in relation to that. The problem, I think, with the latter is it requires policymakers to really hone a whole set of skills together. And we've had a policy in Ireland, I think, for 40 years now of living over the shop, quote unquote. And can I tell you, it's been an utter dismal failure. And I think it's something to do with the fact that it wasn't thought through from a who's going to be there, what is it that's required, what way are they going to live their lives, etc. And there's also an issue which has been very big for us, where our building regulations don't necessarily match fully our planning regulations. So in relation to that, the constraints on actually turning space above inner city shops and retail outlets and offices, the planning regulations are such that that's extremely difficult to do. And it's not clear how it'll be done on any grand scale. Now, at the moment, we've such a housing shortage. If it's going to happen, it should happen now. But it seems to me that you know, our model previously of building a new suburban dwelling again and again and again and rolling out from the city. If you see the maps of Dublin over 50 years, you'll just see circles going out and out and out. It'll be nearly on the west coast at the rate Dublin is going. But that people know how to do that. But do they know actually how to create the right kind of urban buildings in the center of the city? And what are they doing about the aging population? So I'm one of 7 children, and we all lived in the one household. Now most people, I know, have maybe 3 or 4 in a household. So that's, you know, for the same number of people, you're now talking about 2 to 3 houses, 2 to 3 dwellings, actually, not of the same size. So how do we take the housing stock and recalibrate it in a way that will be acceptable societally to the group around? So it's a little bit like the earlier discussion we had about gentrification. But how do we actually do that and get buy-in? So my strong feeling with regard to housing is it needs in every country to have a kind of social conversation about it, what it means, and to get the cross-generational buy-in, which is really essential, because it's the older people like me who are sitting in a large house, and it's the younger people like my children who can't afford a house. And that's just an unsustainable pace for a long period of time. And I think a bad housing market is quite socially divisive and politically divisive. And I think it's great to see it getting this cross-cutting approach where you're looking at social housing as well as you're looking at private housing, as well as you're looking at different modes, because I think that's the secret to maintaining social cohesion while you're going through that transition.
Absolutely. And I think you recall Antonio mentioned in the previous panel about what's happening to the commercial real estate segment. Well, sometimes repurposing of buildings can address some of the issues of shortages in specific areas of our cities. Of course, there are architectural and technological hurdles that need to be overcome. But at the end of the day, it is an example of how regulations can help address an issue of shortages without adding bricks to the urban landscape. Let me, with that, turn back to José David across the water to pick up on one issue that you mentioned in your previous intervention, which was, essentially housing subsidies or government programs that would improve the affordability of housing for lower income social groups. And we know that in many OECD countries, lots of those programs tend to benefit social groups that are not the ones that they are intended to benefit. So, social subsidies sometimes, leak to other parts of the population that are not their intended beneficiaries. How do you think, in your experience and in this area, this issue can be addressed? Incidentally, last year in our economic survey of Costa Rica, José David, we mentioned some of these issues as part of the analysis of how to design those support programs in ways that are watertight, in the sense of making sure that they really reach the social groups that they are meant to reach. What are your thoughts on that and your experience in that respect?
Yeah, well, I think we have to mention that in the case of Costa Rica, in the national financial system for social housing, the family bond for the housing bond, it's a donation that the state do for the gives for the people.
Let's see. Hopefully it will be like the first case that José David will be back in 1 second.
Can you hear me? Yep.
Yes, now we can. Yes, good.
Okay. Sorry, I think it's an unstable connection here. Yeah. Okay, so I was mentioning that in the case of Costa Rica, the family housing bond, it's a donation that the state gives to the families. So they have to meet some requirements that are that are defined by the law. And but it is, of course, a challenge to make sure that everybody is meeting these requirements. And I think that one very special measure, an action that the state took a couple of years ago, and that it's being strengthened by this administration right now, is to use an unique system of beneficiaries of social support that can be used to know every other social support, subsidy, or any type of contribution that the family is receiving. So using all this unique tool that it's called Sinirue, it's the unique system of registration for social support or social aid. It's being very important to prevent that a person that is not meeting the requirements to get the housing support, the housing subsidy or the housing bond, get this in getting this out of the people that really deserves it. So this is one measure, but I have to say that within the general scenario, that within the six main categories of the social categories, social economic categories, that a very big majority, a vast majority, it's been the families that are in the two most vulnerable categories in terms of social economic conditions. So that that shows that the social housing is actually addressing the needs of the people in these two most vulnerable categories. But to increase the effectiveness of the program, we have a very strong coordination with all the institutions from the social area in the government. And I think that this unique tool of registration of the social support is the key because it is mandatory for all of our institutions to use it, to apply it. And so now that we are, for example, when we are called to assist a community or a problem that is on the territory, we begin checking the information in these kind of tools. So that's very, very, very easy and very simple to start to elect and to select, to make a very good, better selection of the potential beneficiaries. Now, it's important to mention that not only the most vulnerable families have the access to this social housing program that we have in Costa Rica, but other people from the categories that are in better conditions, they can access. So that tend to make the discussion to be in the center of the discussion, because sometimes people can be people can have this idea that families that are not in need are getting the social support. But the truth is that these other families that are in better conditions, they can combine the housing bond with a mortgage or a loan, and so that housing bond becomes a tool to overcome the barrier that the families have when it comes to talk about the down payment for the acquisition of their houses. So it's a combination of possibilities that the range of families.
Taking a little longer than before.
For us to
now you're back. It took a little longer than before, but you're back.
Okay, I'm very sorry. No, I was just mentioning, just to finish, that it is true that not only the most vulnerable families are considered in the category that can be subject of the help of a family housing bond. Some other families that are not in the 1, 2, or 3 categories of most vulnerable families, they can get the assistance, but also these other families that are in better conditions. But in those conditions, this family bond, housing bond, it is combined with other tools as mortgage in very special conditions or loans, and so that the family housing bond becomes a tool to overcome the barrier that these other families have when it comes to the down payment in the process to get their housing needs addressed.
Thanks. No, indeed. I mean, we see that in different parts of the world, that targeting housing support programs goes far beyond simple means testing. It's addressing different aspects of vulnerability and different needs of households to access housing, be it in the residential market, or basically the housing for sale, but also in the rental market segment can have important barriers as well. Francis, if I can come back to you. So at the end of the day, if one thinks of housing as an integral part of the competitiveness discussion, and if the problem there is essentially the availability of housing, how can we unblock supply? What needs to be done in this area? And any other thoughts you may have on this front?
Yeah, just to give some kind of scale to it, our new estimates say that we need an extra 50,000 units of housing a year, and we're getting up to 30. So that's a huge, thinking of your figures for Slovenia, that's a very, very big gap. And as that goes on from year to year, you get a whole load of side effects of that. So for example, after the financial crash, I mean, the financial crash had an absolutely catastrophic effect on the Irish housing construction industry. It completely wiped it out. And a lot of the employees in that sector and a lot of the small scale builders who are not Irish return to their home countries. They return to the UK, or they return to Poland, or they return to different parts of Eastern Europe. So a whole tier got wiped out of those people. And then a lot of other people lost a lot of money along the way. So there's massive risk aversion. And one of the things I think that's a really important role for governments is, in fact, to make sure it gives signals that there's going to be building programs going on to the future, so that people who are going into professions or going into considering careers, and they will look and say, building is actually somewhere where I will have a job. Whereas if they talk to their parents, and their parents will say, well, I know all these people who went out of work in 2008, 9 and 10, they're not going to go into that area. So I think it's a really important signal that government should give to try to have a consistent sector that's there. And I know they can move between office buildings and house buildings, but it's a very important signal that's there. After the crash, there was no Irish money available to build anything. So the only people who tended to build was funding from outside Ireland. And that's meant, in fact, that quite a lot of people are getting social housing supports to be in rented accommodation that's seen as very expensive. So there's a kind of an uneasiness about that, and a preference to get back to more social housing that's done on a not-for-profit basis. But the reality is, if the outside funders had not come in at that stage, we would even have a bigger shortage than we have at the moment. So that's really where it gets at. So the question then is, how can you make sure that you can get that number up from 30 to 50,000 pretty quickly? And I mentioned earlier, the over-the-shop housing is one area that's been, as I literally talked about for decades, but I think you could count probably in hundreds the number of units that have actually been created, which just doesn't make any sense at all. And it's linked up with the tradition that people moved out of town once they didn't live over the shop after they became wealthy. They left over the shop, and then that area stayed empty because it wasn't seen as particularly valuable. And that's really why it's been there in a lot of cases. So then it's a question of getting the construction industry back up and running. And as I said, giving signals, I think macro support, macro signals in relation to construction housing, I think are particularly important. But we obviously want then the people in housing who are building new units to adopt all of the sustainability criteria that are there, but also the new modern methods of construction. And that turns out to be quite slow to get people to do because they didn't do it before. And then you've got a lot of risk-averse people in the construction industry. So a lot of people are financing their building by going renovation project to renovation project because they're not taking out loans. We have actually, there's been a lot of research done on the availability of finance for businesses in Ireland. Turns out not to be the constraint. What's much more the constraint is uncertainty about the future. This is the European surveys, the ECB surveys on finance. The answer given is that we're uncertain about the future. So I think making that more certain is particularly important, where you're making a significant investment, for example, in developing a new set of apartments or a new set of buildings that are interconnected. I mean, the other piece in Ireland that has been very weak is we had again, following the crash, the private sector reduced, but the public sector also had to reduce because we didn't have tax revenue. So government stopped investing in infrastructure. So we've now got a recognition by government that we really have to accelerate the amount in infrastructure. On the National Competitiveness and Productivity Council, a number of years ago, we said, look, there has to be at least 5% of the 5% of the budget every year put into capital, infrastructure investment for water and electricity and all the other pieces that are actually needed in order to have housing, new housing. And that's now being recognized, but it needs to be much more than the percentage that we've been given previously because of the backlog. So if you like housing, getting the housing supply up, which is ultimately the way to get housing prices into reasonable shape, a rental cost to be reasonable shape, means you have to be able to build. And what we've, that infrastructure, which was mentioned a number of times in the earlier session, is absolutely pivotal. But it needs to be thought through because the private sector can't. That is ultimately the role of government, is about the public infrastructure. So you can get developers in who might say we'll build a new set of houses here, and that's a good place. But if that isn't fully serviced for electricity and water supply and wastewater, it's not going to happen. So I think I think government should work out what is its role. I think part of its role is to give some degree of certainty in a very uncertain world as far as it can. It's to make the availability of infrastructure there. And also in our case, and I don't know whether other countries have this problem, but we've had tremendous problems with the slowness in planning decisions. And that has delayed things happening. And as they delayed things happening, it creates more uncertainty for somebody who says, well, why would I bother going to do that? So I think there's a particular set of roles that government needs to look at the macro level and at the regulation and the administrative level in order to promote that further.
Absolutely. And another point that I think came up in the previous panel is that when it comes to governance, we see that lots of the key actors responsible for planning, responsible for licensing and permitting, responsible for the provision of infrastructure, responsible for development of the territory, they are not the same people. And in many cases, they don't know each other and they don't talk to each other. So part of getting that if I can use the word ecosystem here, right, has a governance aspect to it that needs to be considered as well. I'm glad, Francis, that you mentioned the issue of planning and licensing, because it is affecting housing in many parts of the world. It is affecting many other areas of infrastructural development that are so important for the infrastructure sector, but also for the transition to a lower carbon economy. We are seeing that in the case of building transmission lines and distribution networks that are often, curtailed because our efforts in those areas are challenged by weaknesses in the housing and in the licensing system in general. Another aspect of competitiveness that we've talked much about. But Mitja, I saw that you were nodding in agreement when Francis mentioned the issue of private sector investment and options for boosting supply. We talked a lot about, in your case, for instance, the rent formula as one mechanism that could be reformed to make investment more predictable, attract more private sector investment in your market segment. What are your thoughts there? What has worked well and what needs to be done for the system to work better?
Doesn't work. Okay, it works. I can just nod to everything what Francis just said regarding the speed of administrative process and the building of infrastructure, which has to basically catch up with the planning and with the speed of the development process. So I mean, I think we have all the same issues, and I can just, if that makes you any happy, I think Slovenia ranks even worse in this land use governance index than Ireland, according to the last analysis that I saw. Yeah. Okay, but coming back to rental level, yes, of course. I mean, at least we at the DSU, we try to be somehow linked between the private investment money and the public funds. So Slovenia, it's particular for Slovenia that we have huge amount of side deposits by physical persons, by citizens lying on the bank, which is not invested at all. So it's a question how to activate this money, also for to be that part of this money and part of these funds would be also directed into affordable or let's say limited profit schemes that we are trying to set up. So the full cost recovery rental calculation, the rental model is definitely prerequisite for that. So we are looking in Slovenia very much to our neighborhood, to Austria, where so-called limited profit housing associations are a sort of cornerstone of their housing law. So I think this could work also with us. So we very much promote also the establishment of full cost recovery. I mean, we will have this in our model, which is not governed by any special law, but it will be inhabited in our business model to have such a calculation of rents, but also for other state-owned social housing providers, this is actually a necessity to change, because current rental level is not sufficient to basically keep up with all the repairs. I mean, repair is one thing, but for the new projects are simply not bankable without such a model. So government is, as far as we are informed, government is currently drafting new law on financing of the non-profit and the limited profit housing associations. So this will have various measures, among others also the redefining the calculation of non-profit rents. So we hope that this will be soon on the table and also approved.
I was going to ask all the panelists later on what is on your top one element on your wish list. Now I know Mitja, so I have to come up with another question for you in the wrap-up round. But let me cross the Atlantic again, go to Oscar. Oscar, you were talking about the different green finance instruments that you have, how it is helping or not with the ultimate objective of reducing energy consumption or increasing efficiency in the use of energy in the properties that you finance. What are your thoughts on what needs to be done in this area? What are the interventions that you think would be able to deliver concrete, tangible improvements in the way you are designing your programs?
Thank you, Luis. Let me address this question now from the side of Infonavit as a lender, and through the way we structure the funding of Infonavit, which is very relevant to us. We are a social security institution, and the funding that we receive is not the market. We are getting our funding directly from payroll contributions from employers, which are deposited in individual accounts of workers, and these individual accounts, by law, has to create some mandatory returns, and essentially the return that we have to pay on these individual accounts, it's the rate of inflation at the minimum. So when you try to structure as a lender with this very stable way of funding, and not the markets again, but the mandatory social security contributions, the quality of the asset, the house that is backing the mortgage that we are issuing to the household becomes very relevant. So in terms of, again, having a policy of zoning, a policy of filtering, where are we going to direct our lending that is conditional on the location of the house and the particular characteristics and features of the houses that we're lending. We are directly providing lending for better assets that are backing the mortgages. And that means that the likelihood, if the asset is better, if the house that we are funding is of a higher quality, the likelihood of repayment or the likelihood of having delinquency from the part of the household on the repayment of the mortgage is lower. So the asset of the quality directly improves the financial long-term solvency of the fund, and therefore we are in a better position to provide these returns to the individual accounts, and the standard flow of funds that we receive and pay back to the individual accounts become more robust. So in terms, when we discuss all these elements of policy of producing a better mortgage in terms of the quality of the asset, these elements of either housing, zoning of the house that we are financing, or the improvements of the house that the house at the individual level the household will do with this cheaper financing that we discussed in the previous round, becomes essential in terms of the solvency of the fund. Going back to the question in general of what needs to be done, I'm gonna relate with my colleagues in the panel. The planning of where to build and what types of coordination at the local level, between federal level and local level, and private investors at the regional level needs to be done. It's very important. Planning in a country of like Mexico, let's say, for instance, in our northern border, there's a lot of discussion right now in terms of this so-called nearshoring effect, in which lots of firms, in general industries, are coming to Mexico, trying to strategically locate their position in order to be able to export at a cheaper cost to the U.S. And that there's a lot of talk in what's going to happen in the next 10 years in the whole 1,000 kilometers that we have in the northern border regarding the needs of infrastructure, the needs of good energy provision, etc. But then comes housing there. In terms of what needs to be done, the relevance of planning and a central coordination between federal authorities and local authorities, even at the municipal level, to adequately know and forecast and have the quality of data needed to try to anticipate what is going to be the real housing demand at the regional level. It's central to be in a position, even though that we are an institution that it's financially strong. The element of planning in order to know where to construct, what types of units that the households are going to be demanding in the next 10 years it's central. So you can have a stable financing like we do. You can have lots of cash to even subsidize rates, etc. But the central thing in the long term, the way we see it is we need to anticipate correctly with a proper coordination of between all the participants, not only public, of course, but centrally private as well, foreign and national, to anticipate where is the demand of housing coming in the distinct regions of the country. Francis was discussing the order of magnitude of the supply side of the number of units or housing units that different countries need. Mexico is not an exception. We're starting a new government here. Last week, there was the change of administration in our country. And for the new president, the supply side of housing is at the center of some of the policies that she's going to promote. And directly constructing in combination of government and private sector is going to be very relevant in the next few years.
Thanks for that, Oscar, for bringing back the notion of competitiveness into it. No, it's interesting to see Ireland, Mexico, two countries as far afield as Mexico and Ireland, are facing issues related to competitiveness that place housing at the core of some of these policy debates. So it's interesting to see that across the Atlantic as well, and also for mentioning earlier on the issue that what you're trying to do to improve asset quality is good not only for your borrowers by increasing the credit worthiness, but also your own funding profile as well. So co-benefits in this area are the ones that go to the core of what the green finance instruments can do for housing finance. It's wish list time. Mitja has already put that on the table. Francis, if I can get back to you on that. Tell us about your top 1 or 2 elements on your wish list.
You're going to limit me to 1 or 2. No, but just saying in relation to that, we're just in the process of doing in Ireland at the moment a national spatial framework. And that's an attempt to bring the housing and the business pieces together. Because what tends to happen is the demographers and the social, the sort of social side of policy departments focus on the housing bit. And meanwhile, you've got in the industry side of the economy going off on its own. And what's really very crucial, I think there, and which we haven't used as much in Ireland as I think we should, is the role of chambers of commerce in the smaller cities and the towns where you're decentralizing from the big center, because they're actually seeing where people are living, where they're purchasing, where they're working, and they're all part of an integrated community. So, I mean, I just would like to say, I think it's a really important thing. And it certainly did strike me that there was a real need for people committing to that kind of framework. So what's my wish list? Okay, I'm going to make this tiny. I just want,
as well.
No, I want housing to be a whole of government issue. I suppose that brings me back from the fact that I got interested in this side of it coming from the competitiveness side, which most people would see as far away from housing as you might be. People thinking housing is a non-traded good. What has it anything to do with global competitiveness? So I want it to be a whole of government issue, because I think if it's not done in that way, it should interlink with labour market policies. It should link in with a whole load of other policies, energy policies, supply of infrastructure, etc., that we're doing, how we're educating people, and where people, for example, are working from home more than they did in the past. I think all of these things need to be thought together. Now, I'm not in for a kind of Pollyanna solution to all of it, but they need to be rehearsed so that no big gap is there. And we're looking at this back in 25 years, sitting on a platform like this saying, how the heck did we not notice X? And I think that's important. I think though, I don't know whether this would be true for the other countries, but I think for Ireland, we actually need a public conversation about spatial planning. Because we've gone through a period of, major economic growth over a period, a lot of social change. We've now gone from monoculturalism to multiculturalism. We've gone from a situation where we had very minimal supports, social supports for people, into more major ones. We're taking on board, but we're miles from meeting our climate targets. And I think this is our built environment, which is heavily linked to all of the above. So I would like to see a conversation about that because of, as I said at the beginning, our history of dispersed and declining population has meant that what it means to live more closely together, to have good shared spaces, which I think is crucial. When people were talking earlier on about gentrification, I think that's where these issues really come into play. I think that's what I would like to see it. So government, I want whole of government leadership, nothing small, whole of government leadership, and a conversation so that we can actually say, yes, I grew up in this kind of house, but actually that's not necessarily where I want to retire to, or that's not necessarily the kind of housing that are best suited to my children.
You get to have another wish list.
Yeah, if I can strip down to 3 topics, perhaps. Definitely as Francis said, that the better understanding for the government, the entire government, about the real reasons for the problem. This is one of my first priorities, actually, because we have really contradictory data which are not properly analyzed. We have aging population, vacancy rates which are not understandable, but these vacancy rates we can put in perspective of different lifestyle in 70s and 80s, different priorities which don't meet current demand of the young people, which are totally different in lifestyle, in their demands, in needs, in flexibility of their living concept, and so on. So the other issue, of course, is we will have to decide what is priority somehow. This is also comes to the spatial planning. Now, is it a nature which has higher priorities, or living of the people which has a little bit higher priority in terms of the getting the licenses to build in the certain protected area? Actually, in Slovenia, we have almost entire country under environmental protection, which gives almost impossible to build anywhere out of the urban zones at the moment. And of course, the third thing is, for me personally, the relative stability of the construction prices for the next 10 years, or predictability at least now. So.
Very good. Jose David, your wish list.
Thank you. Well, I think it's a combination of two major points for me, in taking into account all our conditions and the situations and barriers and challenges that we have to face here in our country. And I must say that it's a combination of a modernization and updating of the social housing system that can include not only the donation of a family housing bond, but also other types of options like renting, leasing, and more options that can be more suitable for the population that is changing, that it's within the different groups of population, there are differences and that need to be taken into account to give them a better response to address in a better way the needs of housing for all of these populations. But also the second point that I would like to say is to strengthen, to make better the role of the state in terms of directing the investment to make sure that the offer from the private sector is meeting the needs of the public sector of our country, of our government, in a better, in a correct way. Especially taking into account the differences that are in the territories. So we need to be sure that this offer that comes from the private sector is going to the places that we need that investment to go, to be able to address in the better way this shortage of housing that we were talking in the beginning of our participation. And finally, I would like to also refer to this balance that were put over the table in terms of planning, building, and also housing, because for example, in Costa Rica, we have the building codes and building regulation. It's very well accepted, it's very well developed, but planning it's in the local level responsibilities, and housing is in the national level. And we, as a small country, we don't have a medium a middle level. We have local level of government and also national level of government. So that demands from us a very active effort in terms of political coordination and in terms of develop. And I think that here is the key to develop the correct tools, the best tools to articulate these two level of governments, at least for us that we have this organization of our state, local development with the municipalities and the national level in the government, in the central government. All of this has to be performed taking into account this green perspective that it's very included in our public policy, as you may know, and that is why we are also promoting the mechanisms to include in this in both in the public policies level and also in the project level of housing, I mean the social housing project level.
Very good. Oscar, your wish list.
It has, I guess, just one element, and we're kind of working through this group towards that direction. Let me say, I believe that during the past, say, 30 years, the focus of the multilateral agencies, the OECD and IMF, etc., when they come to visit countries and review them, so the main emphasis is fiscal sustainability. How are you managing your debt? How are you managing, again, some specific elements of your financial system? Are the banks solvent or not? And then, I mean, it's good, and of course, something that's central in the stability of a country. But elevating or bringing housing at this level of scrutiny, at this level of analysis, at the multilateral level, and having these elements of review in which housing is studied and addressed and questioned on all the elements that it has influence into, like competitiveness, like we said, energy use, like the demographics in the country, like the expansion 10 years from now, planning, etc. It's so important that the correct understanding at the country level of how people live has a huge impact on productivity of this country, and therefore in its solvency in the long term in terms of economic performance. So I guess in the wish list is to just keep working together to bring housing at the very center to measure the potential of a country. Policies of housing has the same or more impact that let me say it like this, of the way you structure your debt or manage your fiscal policy in isolation. So I would say that let's bring housing to the center of these multilateral discussions, and then this will bring light and more data and more studies and more research on how important is understanding housing in the long term.
Couldn't agree more, Oscar. I think nobody here couldn't agree more. Do we have time for a couple of questions, Boris? Yeah, or one at least. Anybody with a burning desire to ask the panelists a question? Yeah, anything online? Yeah, okay.
Yes, a question online for Oscar Vela on the policy to facilitate mortgage borrowing. Are there estimates of the mortgage interest rate reductions that these policy interventions have achieved? Is there a risk that they could contribute to price increases? And if so, are there estimates of possible price effects?
Oscar, did you get that?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Quick answer: yes, we do have estimates of the impact on rate reductions and the magnitude of them. And let me say, relative to the market rate of mortgage in Mexico, which is around 11 points, the rate in Mexico, we are charging 3 percentage points less than that on average. And for the lowest income families, the households with at the lower part of the income distribution, we're charging up to 6 percentage points less than the market rate. That's the way we've working through that. And the second part of the question is very relevant. We have this current permanent discussions with the Central Bank of Mexico of whether this subsidizing of the rates could create some impact on prices and therefore some kind of potential bubbles in terms of pricing of houses. Cheaper lending could mean increasing prices in the long term. So we're currently discussing with the central bank. We do not have evidence as of now that this is happening in Mexico, and the prices are mainly determined by the supply side of the housing sector right now. So scarcity of houses and in general, the high inflation of housing production has turned the prices up in the recent years. So there's the issue of monitoring permanently how the pass-through of lower interest rates in mortgages into the prices of houses are of our interest, and we keep an eye on that. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, Oscar. Well, it's been a fascinating afternoon, really. I usually end the panel by saying something along the lines that I would not even attempt to summarize this, and I'll maintain that line. I don't want to annoy anyone by not doing justice to what they've said, but I'll try something perilous here, which is at least there are 4 keywords that I was writing down, and I wrote down, underlined, and then drew a circle around it that came up in the discussion now. Several of you mentioned the centrality of housing policies in public policies in general. I think that needs to be underlined. One of you mentioned housing is no residual policy. I think to me that's also an extremely important point, that it shouldn't really be treated as one more a footnote to public policies in general. Housing really cuts across all the discussions we've had, all the policy objectives that we've mentioned. Another point is the need to understand the drivers of what's happening in housing markets to reflect the evolving demands and needs of our societies. So not only the centrality of housing, but this constant evolution in terms of how housing policies need to be designed and implemented. The issue of policy uncertainty also came up in the discussions as a way of essentially, making sure that there is visibility, there is a pre-visibility in this area when you're designing housing policies or implementing reforms in that area. And the last one that I think was underscored several times, the need for quality information, data, defining the issues and measuring it, which goes to the core of what the OECD does. So I thought that would be also an interesting point to put on the table that definitely helps how governments implement policies, how we help countries design and evaluate their policies. Let me stop with that, bring this to a close, but I would also like, on behalf of all of us, to thank Peter, who couldn't be here today, to join us online, Boris, Volker, Nathalie, Elsa, Veronica, for making this happen today. Let me thank all of you who have joined us online, all of you here in person. I think it was clear throughout the discussions today that it has been a fantastic journey to come up with this agenda for housing policy reform. It's really a culmination of years of work across different areas of the OECD. It's also obvious that housing is not going to go away. It's an issue that will stay with us for good and bad reasons. So hopefully we'll have other opportunities in the future to be together and to compare notes about how we can all make progress in this very important policy area. But again, thanks all for joining us today. And please join me in thanking the panelists, Francis, Mitya, Jose David, and Oscar for joining us today. Thank you very much.